Art Chat is made possible by the support of the Artistic Harmonies Association. Create your next aha experience with us. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Art Chat. I'm your host, Linda Riesenberg Fisler, and I have with me one of my good friends. And, you know, I think back to when I first met Dick and Joanna, and I just kind of laugh because I had no idea that Joanna was a Broadway dancer and star, and Dick was a film producer. And I'm sitting there chatting with them like, you know, ordinary people, which they are very much ordinary people. But, you know, I had like no idea your role in everything. I went out and read your bio before. That's out on your LinkedIn page. So Dick Atkins does have a LinkedIn page, and he has an IMDb page. So if you want to know more about Dick, his background and what he did coming up, you know, please go out and look at that and follow Dick and Lincoln. That would be kind of fun for Dick to have a lot more followers coming out. And what we're going to talk about a little bit today, Dick is an honorary member to Artistic Harmonies Association, our sponsor, and well, the association that I founded with John Anderson. And we had an honorary members meeting, and Dick introduced himself to really a very diverse group of people. I think that was on that call, from artists all the way to filmmakers to independent filmmaker. Well, actually, Karen wasn't on there, but we had a diverse group of people that work in fundraising. I mean, it was really kind of interesting to talk about Artistic Harmonies with that. So welcome, Dick. How you been doing?
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here with you again. We're doing okay. We're hanging in there.
Yeah.
You know, crazy times in the country.
Oh yeah, well, we're not going to go there. We want to be happy.
No, we won't go. We'll stick to the arts.
Yeah, we'll stick to the arts.
That's right.
Yeah, there's been a time when I'm like, maybe I should start a podcast, and I'm like, no, I don't. There's enough out there already. We're not going to go there. We're going to stay happy and be in the arts, and then don't worry, be happy time kind of frame of mind. So, and thank you in advance for actually attending the call for Artistic Harmonies, and also being an honorary member, because there's so much that we, you know, I assume in filmmaking and producing and writing that, and there's of course different genres of writing. There's the novel writing and the screenwriting, and you know TV series writing, I'm sure, is slightly different than screenwriting. So having someone with your background, since you went from producing television series, I guess, with Procter and Gamble back in the the soap opera days. Yeah, and in the movies.
Share that Procter and Gamble connection.
Yeah, we do. You know, and I was sitting there thinking the other day too. I was sitting there the other day thinking, I was in the wrong part of Procter and Gamble. I should have been in the part where you were dealing with me, but yeah, it's okay. I was in research and development there, but anyway, yeah. So you have this great background that I think you could bring a lot of interesting information to. When we get to the point where we start looking at film and that model and how that's structured. And we talked a little bit about this in the green room, but before we get into all of that, I want to congratulate you also on securing the rights for Tiffany Johnson's story. And I think I got her last name right.
Thank you. Well, yeah. she's had many last names.
Twist.
She is a serial marrier. So,
okay.
she's had many last names through the years, but yes, Johnson was one of the early marriages, which may or may not have been legal at the time, and we can get into that subject of the story if you want. But yeah, she is quite a story, and interestingly, I just addressed that in a blog post / short article that I was asked to do by one of the major gay and lesbian magazine websites, because of this movie and this subject. So they said, would you talk about maybe how you got together with Tiffany, what you feel about LGBTQ issues with the movies and with Hollywood, and that sort of thing. So I did in a short piece explore how we came together and the process of trying to sell a story of that sort to Hollywood and to the business, which had really evolved over the years. And I'm hopeful now that the times have caught up with the story, and the moment now, as I say in the piece, that the moment now will find the story rather than the story having to find its moment.
Right. It was really interesting. I've been watching on Prime the A League of Their Own, which is a series now, was a film. The film didn't really examine the relationships, the gay relationships between the players, that they kind of glossed over it, where this miniseries now focuses on what it was like to be lesbian, and playing ball and having the spotlight on them, and yet they had to act, in that particular time, we're talking, World War II when this happened, how they had to present themselves as these glamorous ladies, and and the league was promoting them, especially the ones that were married, as the housewife who cooks spaghetti, and and all. It was always that type of presentation, and all of that was glossed over. And then they also included in it as well as an African American or Black actress who was playing someone who wanted to be a pitcher, and of course they weren't segregated then, so they had the Negro leagues, and then they had the white female league, and it was still that segregation even on the male side as well. So it was interesting to see how each set of characters were fighting for, almost say, existence, or to live the life that they wanted to live. And it was interesting from that standpoint. A lot of the same plot line, I guess you could say. One player gets traded at the end.
True. This one, of course, being a true story, having that advantage besides, and taking place in and around the U.S. military as a background. Very unlikely place, but as you say, in a time when none of it was accepted.
Yes.
In that environment in particular. So it's interesting now where the pendulum has swung from, as I also say in that article, from indifference to hostility to slow acceptance to now open advocacy. There's projects all over the place of this type. But it still interests me that Tiffany's story primarily took place before all that. She doesn't have her experience is not the experience that people are going through now, even though she's still living the life in her way. But in all these dramatic events in and around the military, it was before all of this.
Right.
It was even before Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
I was just going to say that. Yep.
92-ish, give or take. That's when her whole story kind of blew up. So it's fascinating in that way. And as I say there too, number one, that I love true stories, because I love that added aspect of this really happened as I'm watching it. This really happened. And that I'm always interested in an individual or set of individuals, story, rather than, I'm not looking to do a movie about a cause or to do it for advocacy. All very well and good, all necessary, all laudable. Not what I'm necessarily, that's not my goal. My goal is to tell an individual story when I think that's very dramatic, and because that's real in itself, and you learn the complexities of life in the story of an individual.
Right.
That, to me, is very much the case with Tiffany.
Right. So. Yeah. I can't wait to see. This one's got a long way to go. So before we
Yes.
before we start talking about where we are in the process of funding and all of that good stuff, like funding a movie or funding TV, because that's all different, which I've learned from you, mostly in the green room, but kind of had a suspicion of before. But just, I mean, just from knowing you and George Gallo and listening to all of the things that you have to go through, and has it really made it yet, and hasn't it made it, you know? So let's touch real quick, because the last time I had you on, we talked about the dinner set gang, and
Yeah.
where you were with the dinner set gang, and we talked a little bit about 60 Minutes and all of that, you know, that happened back when you first started. Did you write Dinner Set Game yourself, or did you?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
I originally wrote up Dinner Set Gang is the story of the best jewel thief team ever in America.
Right.
True story, of course. Two guys who were brothers-in-law, married to identical twin sisters from a mob family. So all the family dynamics going on, aside from the major jewel heists that they accomplished,
Right.
and they were the best in the late 60s and early 70s, and ended up on witness protection, and all sorts of
Fun things.
Crazy dramatic things that you might imagine might come along with that life in the 70s. But I found the story, and as an independent producer, I would say, rather than a friend of mine coined a term a while ago, calling people dependent producers. And the dependent producers are the ones who had the deals with the studios.
Okay.
The studios gave an office on the Universal lot, and they gave them a budget to deal with, to go option projects and pay people and pay a staff and all that sort of stuff. And that producer was dependent on that studio, and went to that studio first, obviously, with their project.
Right.
An independent producer, you're sort of on your own. You're trying to piece things together any which way that you can. And so I always figured that I have to find stories where the guys much bigger than me can't find them or don't find them. So if I could find the kernel of a story, and then I could piece that together and be the first one to have that story. And that has been the case in both these things we're talking about, the jewel thief story, where actually the son of one of the jewel thieves wrote me an email and said, my dad has a pretty interesting story and he's ready to tell it. And I started to explore it with this fellow's father, and then with his partner, who was still behind bars. So all of those stories of talking on the phone through the glass, everything you see in movies all the time, was able to piece that story over time. And as I think we've talked about before, it's sort of a belief of mine that you have to make yourself findable, discoverable. You enter story.
Right.
Because knocking on doors is tremendously difficult to try and convince people. So if you can get people to come to you rather than the other way around, right, you are miles ahead of the game. So with a little exploration and finagling, I was able to get first Court TV and then 60 Minutes to come to me about the story. And and that certainly helped put it out there in the Hollywood zeitgeist and whatnot. But then it's still a matter of finding the right group at the right time with the right studio, network, funder, whatnot.
Right.
And when one of the big talent agencies introduced George Gallo and me to each other, that was a wonderful step, not only for that project, but for a friendship that has blossomed.
Yes.
And the fabulous guy, which you don't find enough of in Hollywood.
Absolutely.
And so we have been working and exploring all of that. So to answer your question, George initially did feature scripts.
Oh, okay.
Which we have explored. Then we made a deal with NBC on a series concept, and George and a young partner of his at the time did a pilot script, which NBC liked, but then sort of didn't make the cut when they decided to make their pilots. And then we've still been talking now about both ends of it, either as a feature, it'd be funded independently, the way George has done quite a few things recently, and or a TV series. So during the pandemic, George was busy with other things, so I sat down and wrote a pilot script for a limited series. Cool. So when your question was, did I write a script? Yes and no. George wrote a version of the script. I wrote a version of the pilot script, and so we're circulating with those now and seeing which we can pop up first, the series side or the feature side.
Right, and it always amazes me how difficult it is, but also how much work goes into the speculation part of the movie business. I mean, you said George wrote one, you've wrote a script, George wrote a script, you're out there pitching it. I don't know how many times you've pitched it or George has pitched it, but it's been pitched a number of times that I can tell. The same with, I assume that you're going through the same process with Tiffany's story. You've got to find the people that you pitch to, and you have the rights to it. That means nobody else can take that right because you've secured the rights on it. Exactly. But it doesn't mean that it's going to get made.
Yes, it's another example of where I found a story, luckily sort of where no one else did. I was writing an Army themed script some years ago, so I subscribed to the Army Times newspaper just for background and to get the lingo right. Not having served myself. And I see this fascinating article pop up in the Army Times newspaper that says gay lover lives as spouse, Army spouse, and that was the headline. And I read this article, I'm thinking, oh my God, what is the story? And it's interesting because in those days, the headline wasn't really even technically correct because Tiffany was not gay, Tiffany was transgender. But it was before they even used the word transgender. They were using transsexual to a certain extent and, and whatnot, other terms. But Tiffany has never been gay. She's been transgender, born a boy and felt born in the wrong body. And when I discovered this, I tracked her down. I was able to track her down in Ohio, in your old neck of the woods.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I brought her east here, and I went out to Ohio and explored with her, and we spent hours and hours and hours together, sort of building trust and building her story, finding out her story and trying to piece it together again. So
that leads to the question, wait, are we talking, hold on, hold 1 second, I just need to know, Air Force, Army, Navy? It can't be Navy if she was in Ohio.
No. This is before, she grew up in Ohio.
Oh, she grew up in Ohio, okay.
And she had returned to Ohio, so that's where I was able to track her down and find her.
Okay.
In between, to escape Ohio, sorry about that.
No, I escaped Ohio. I'm in Asheville. I'm in Asheville.
As you have, that's right. But more to escape her family situation, she did the most unlikely thing at that time, a young boy who wanted to live a different life. She walked into a recruiting station in Youngstown, Ohio.
Oh, in Youngstown, okay.
Who in her situation at that point would think to walk into a military recruiting station, and the branches of the service were also desperate for soldiers that all four branches, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, were all waving to this young boy, come here, come here, come here, come here. Make a long story short, he ended up in the Air Force because it had the most stringent mental requirements, and he was very smart, but least stringent physical requirements because he was a young boy. So the Air Force, was most suitable. To make a long story short, he spent some years in the Air Force with experiences that you might imagine, some pluses, some very minuses, lived his days as a male soldier, his nights as a woman. And
interesting.
Until the Air Force finally said, this is not tenable. We like you. You're very likable, but we just can't have it. It's not acceptable. But they gave young Stevie, an honorable discharge, and he was out of the Air Force. At which point he had to decide, do I go back home to a difficult situation back in Ohio, or do I try and live the way I would like to as a woman from here on? Young Stevie chose that path. First Stephanie and then Tiffany was born from that. She had some very interesting experiences in between, dealing with soldiers on the Army bases and whatnot, all the while starting to marry soldiers, which might sound a little weird, except that what she was always looking for was to be accepted
and to be loved.
To find love, and to find love.
Yes.
Like all of us. And she kept searching until one day she met a naive young Army sergeant who didn't know anything about her past, followed him to Georgia when he was transferred. He was a North Carolina boy, by the way. And they married, church wedding, everything.
Nice.
And she spent the next 7 years as an Army spouse, getting all spousal benefits of the military, doing fashion shows with other wives, and living a life until the husband got transferred to Germany and wanted her to come over, and she needed a passport to do it. And she went to the office on the Army base and submitted papers, including a birth certificate. And the State Department called the military base and said, excuse me, what's going on here? Things don't quite match, so to say the least. And that led to a whole blow up where the Army Criminal Investigation Command dragged the husband off the training field in Germany and said, are you married to a man or a woman? And he said, I don't know. That was his answer. Oh my goodness. And the whole story blew up. She found a writer at the Army Times newspaper, and that's where I saw it. And that's where so very interesting. So I was able to find the story. I initially tried to explain this story to some people in LA, to HBO, to CBS. They
Amazon. The list goes on, right?
They didn't exist initially then.
Okay.
I was trying to explain this story at a time of somewhere in between the indifferent and hostility period.
Okay.
I even had a famous actor that I worked with who I thought could be in this story, and I want to name him because he's a wonderful guy. But I said to him, I think you'd be great in this. And he took one look at it and he said, what would make you think I would do something like that?
Ooh.
Period, Now, be a wonderful role. So to say I got some resistance or disbelief or not so much hostility then, but just incredulity. They couldn't quite understand what I was talking about. And it's been quite a process, quite a journey of Hollywood coming to understanding of these types of stories. And
Hollywood has a little bit of history with that. When you look at the Black actors and actresses and equality there. And now we're talking about equality for trans, LBGQT. That is now, there's looking for equality in that particular instance. And I mean, as someone like you who grew up in the time when we were talking civil rights, and we're growing up in the time where we were trying to get civil rights and equal rights, the ERA, for example, which still hasn't been ratified for women. So all of this, we're still fighting. We're all still fighting to get that equal rights and the civil rights in place. And I'm happy to, hear about this film and certainly supportive of it. And also Dinner Set Game, because I'm just kind of like really intrigued with that one, because we've talked about that cases a long time ago.
Very, very different areas of life.
Yes, they are. They could be further on the spectrum. So.
Listen, both fascinating in their own way. And what they do, like so many good stories, is they bring you into a world that's unfamiliar.
Right.
People living a life that you don't really know a lot about. And you don't know what it's like to live that life. And not in an entertaining way, and not in what I call an in-your-face educational way. I mean, you're living the experience of somebody who had that. Way, we're not trying to, I don't want to hit people over the head. I don't want to teach them something necessarily, unless they might learn something, as I did, from becoming familiar with these worlds, either the life of professional thieves, or a person in transition, in other ways. So but all make for fascinating stories, and that's what I've always been after, and what I've read. So I would say the majority of stories that I have produced as TV movies or small features or whatever have been true stories, have been based on, not all, but most.
Right. So even we'll get to that. I don't want to jump ahead too far. So one thing, like we were just talking about, an entertaining movie, not so much like in your face educational, but yet pique enough interest to make you possibly do some research on it on your own, learn about that particular thing. And so you have that side of quote unquote Hollywood that makes those kind of films. And then, as I told you in an email, I've been watching this Star Wars is like, I loved Star Wars, the first three, the first three. Okay. The ones after that, I'm kind of like, yeah. Now we're into marketing. Now we're into blow everything up, so I thought it was interesting from the standpoint, we made this Great George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, a number of other people that were involved with him, Richard Idlin, John Dykstra, all of the folks that came in and did the stop motion photography and all the different special effects, and having a model and blowing, having a little firecracker or whatever in there to make it look like it exploded. And, all of this research, which is absolutely fascinating, how we went from 2001: A Space Odyssey to Star Wars, to Raiders, to the Marvel comics franchise that's out there now, all owned by Disney pretty much now. So with Pixar. And
do you believe my first job out of college was with Marvel Comics?
Was it? I didn't know that.
I went to work with I had met the chairman of the conglomerate who owned Marvel at that time, and he said, come work in a few of our divisions and see what you like. And the day after college graduation, I went to work at Marvel Comics.
Wow.
With Stan Lee at the time.
Oh, wow.
I remember having lunch with at the Friars Club in New York before I went to work there. And then with Stan, who was a fascinating guy. You think I should have stayed with Marvel all these years?
Wow. Who would have known? Yeah.
Then when it was just comic books that we'd all read under the covers at night, to stay up late, that this would explode like a supernova in Hollywood.
Yep.
But all due, as I think you're alluding to the special effects and the CGI, the computer graphics catching up to, the wishes of the story. Things that couldn't be done back then. And now it's all the rage.
Yeah.
Not only all the rage, almost all that's done in feature films.
Right. It's almost too much special effects, I think.
Right.
There's times when I just want to watch a movie and not have in your face special effects and sounds, and it's like I just want to calm down a little bit. Watch an interesting
case, yes, I think we discussed this off camera a few days ago, even that listen, for my taste, I've used computer graphics sparingly when it's helpful for a particular shot. You shoot in front of a green screen, as they say, and then the computer matches a different background, and you can get the effect of somebody falling off a balcony, as we did in one movie, without having to imperil the star.
Or the stuntman.
Well, that doesn't sound good. Oh my God. Dangle them, in a way as they fall, and then match it in with computers later.
Right.
So I've done that sort of thing, but I guess even back to the fact that I like true stories.
Mm-hmm.
I like things to happen truthfully in front of me in a way. I like to think that what I'm watching is what happened. Right. I mean, I even like it when somebody like Tom Cruise does his own stunts, because it's him. I know it's him. It's not a stand-in. It's not a stunt man, that sort of thing. It just adds that extra little bit of credibility to everything. And I think if we go too far down the road of everything being computer generated, we may as well do an animation.
Well, ILM's getting there. They had a CGI'd, if you will, Princess Leia in one of the Star Wars, because Carrie's not around anymore.
If they can start to literally bring back actors who passed away many years ago and bring them back and bring their voices back, and it's
what are we doing to the actors and the actresses at this point?
Exactly.
And then Scorsese jumped on board with The Irishman and tried to make De Niro and everybody look younger. Pesky, I think, was in there too, and and CGI their face basically and computer manipulating it. So, but I told Tom, I said that one was a little. I don't know if you've seen The Irishman, but that one was a little strange for me, because the guy had on like a 40-year-old face, but he still had an 80-year-old body. I don't know how old Robert De Niro is. I probably shouldn't say 80, but had an old man body. Let's just put it that way. And I'm like, but he's ticking like he's 80 years old, So
well, that's interesting you say that, because I did see interviews with Scorsese, and I remember one with Scorsese and Pacino and De Niro.
Because Pacino was in that one too. Yeah.
Right. And they were saying that Scorsese was saying, I'd be sitting on the set and everything. I have to remind Bob, De Niro, that he's not 70 years old in this scene. He's 40 years old, and he has to sit differently, and he has to do this or do that, and somebody would whisper in my ear. Now, this is Scorsese talking, saying, you know what, I have to tell Pacino that he's not saying this quite correctly because it's not for the right age. And I'm thinking, I can't say that to him. You say that to him. This is Scorsese talking, that he's afraid to talk to his megastars in that way. I've run into that sort of thing a number of times with the managers and agents in particular, saying, where I had one big star on a TV project who can be nameless, but he used to sing The Gambler, but
not so nameless. Go ahead.
Oh my goodness! But who couldn't say he couldn't remember a line. He couldn't do this. Couldn't do this. And I said to his manager, who happened to be there, I said, "You have to go speak to him." He said to me, "I can't talk to him. I can't say that to him. You have to talk to him." And I'm thinking, you're the guy who just told me last night at dinner that it's so good that your client had to make $60 million a year so that your commission and fee on his money was so great. And now you're telling me you can't walk in the door and have a conversation with him. So I did, this young producer, I go in and talk to him, but it's very interesting. But yes, that movie and that experience was interesting for all of them, because not only did they have to make the look proper, they had to speak in different ages. They had to sit in different ages and all of that sort of thing. So
yeah, walk differently.
Now the audience doesn't always realize, of course, it's going into the making of the movie.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, so that, like, again, there's this whole broad scale of things that are going on out there. You've got the super, special effects and CGI and all that type of movies out there. And then, but I see a lot more about that, like the Marvel stuff and like on TV. And we're in an interesting position at this point when you start talking about the cinemas that these movies are made for are in a position now where they're going bankrupt because people got away from going to the cinema to see a movie every week because of COVID. And, it's like, well, gosh, I can sit in the comfort of my own home, watch a movie, pay $20, have whatever, I pause it when I need to pause it, and it's like, so you have these mega budgets because doing the CGI and the special effects isn't cheap. That's where a lot of, and then you're going to pay a lot of money to get the big stars to come in to star in it, so that you've got people who follow, I don't know, Brad Pitt, let's just say, because I think he's in one of these movies, but you could tell I don't watch these. So I have like zero interest in these, even though I was a big Star Wars fan. I'm still at the point where it's like, too much, but you have that budget for the actors. And then I think there's the one that's like, maybe it's Captain America, I don't know, Robert Downey Jr. I think is in it, and Scarlett is it Iron Man? Okay, and Scarlett Johansson's in there. I mean, these are people that are demanding a big fee to be in your movie. These are the mega stars.
It's interesting you mentioned Scarlett Johansson, because it was a big lawsuit that she filed and bone of contention with Disney during the pandemic, when so many of the studios were deciding to put it on their streaming outlets at the same time as they put it in theaters, if they even did put it in theaters.
Don't know if they did or not, but
and she felt they did, and she felt that tremendously cannibalized the box office, of course, that she was entitled to a big piece of. So she sued Disney and got a huge settlement out of it. Because this has been an ongoing bone of contention that has only started to grow with the growth of the streaming outlets, with the Netflix and Amazons of the world, but was so exacerbated by the pandemic, as you say, when people weren't going to theaters, so productions were shutting down, revenue coming into the studios if they couldn't get new content out there. So what they had on their shelves, they wanted to get out there, and they got out on the streaming outlet when people weren't going to. And now it's a mixture.
And it's really, I think I read a couple days ago that Regal Cinemas is going to be filing for bankruptcy, which is one of the biggest cinemas out there. I mean, they own a lot. So then you become, so what's going to happen now? Because the people that own the distribution, the big Hollywood studios, you have your independents that go to the independent theaters, which I don't know how they're doing. If the big theater cinemas are having problems, the independents have got to be having problems too. I mean, it's the same thing. Do I go sit in an independent theater, or do I sit in the big Regal Cinemas? But you get to the point where it's like, so is Hollywood now going to be taking over Regal Cinemas so that they have an outlet for these major, films that have all these great special effects and everything? I mean, the thing that
you're throwing back to the initial days of Hollywood, when the studios did own the theater chains.
Yep.
The same guys who founded the studios, the Carl Laemmles with Universal and the Warner Brothers and whatnot,
yep.
they
GMG,
also own the
GM.
theaters. They own the theaters. The Warner Brothers, one would be in Hollywood, running the studio, the other would be in New York, handling the theaters and whatnot. But then it became a consent decree with the government, and they couldn't own the theaters at the same time. So now what you're suggesting is a way of going back with cycles of business.
Well, and they're somewhat already back to that with streaming, aren't they? I mean, you have Prime Video, you have Netflix.
Yes, well, things are combining every which way. Here's Amazon buying MGM. Now, who would think MGM, the preeminent studio of the old days, now Amazon buys MGM. So it's the bookseller and now streaming outlet buys the movie studio.
Yeah.
So
you probably saw my. Go ahead, Dick. I'm sorry.
No. I'm just saying things are merging again in a way that they used to be.
Yeah. I mean, you probably saw the look on my face. I was like, wait, isn't there antitrust laws? We won't go into that either. That's another political one.
Now that there is enough competition, that.
Well, that's true.
Sure. Why not? There are enough channels, enough streaming outlets. So MGM isn't really a physical studio anymore. They don't own the old MGM lot.
Right, that's gone.
Sony does. I think it was Sony, right? Sometimes Sony owned the old MGM lot.
Might be, but somebody owns Sony now, don't they?
No, Sony's still Sony.
Is it? Okay.
Sony owns Columbia Pictures.
That's what it is. Okay, I knew there was some connection there. I was thinking Paramount. So, Paramount has their own thing now.
Oh my God! So it's MGM, instead of owning that classic studio, became just another really big giant production company and distributor in a big office building. Unlike still the existing studio lots like Universal and Warner Brothers and Fox, and which are still fascinating. That it goes back to old Hollywood, and I used to love to go out there and just wander around. If I had a meeting, at one of those studios, I would just go out and wander around the studio lot, like I was somebody, and just get a kick out of that. About being part of that whole world.
Yeah, I would love that too. I haven't had that opportunity yet, but I did manage to put my application in at Lucasfilm Limited, and basically was told if I could. I bugged the heck out of Lawrence Kasdan's secretary, Bobby Tyler. I called her every week on a Friday after rolling out toilet paper to test at Procter and Gamble. And I call her every Friday and go, Bobby, please tell me my file's in there. And she's like, well, no. And she, don't worry about it, all that kind of stuff. So finally, they did a calling for, they were getting ready to film Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I called Bobby, and Bobby said, don't faint, but I slipped it in, and here's I was like a 19, 20-year-old. My only background was testing toilet paper. Okay. So I didn't go to college or anything like that, but I wanted to go out there and I wanted to work. And she said, I slipped it in. It's in Lawrence Kasdan's office. Let me put you through. So he picked up the phone and he said, Linda, you don't have any experience. I saw your file. Bobby put it right up on top. And she said, but you don't have any experience. So if you're going to come out here, I'll find something for you, meaning like Gopher probably, or that thing where like on Marilyn and Me, where I get quoted as an assistant producer and all I'm doing is running and getting coffee or something. But, that's what I figured it was. And quite honestly, I had a job at Procter & Gamble, where I could have had a job for the rest of my life, and did. I had 26 years there. So I one Friday night, I was like so depressed. I decided, I'm going to go for it. So I threw in a couple pairs of jeans in the back of my car, my payment book for my car. Don't ask me how I was going to make payments. And I started to head out west, made it as far as Indianapolis, and went, you could tell I was like 19. My parents are going to kill me. So I turned around.
I mentioned it to them.
So I turned around and came home. I think I had 3 Miller Lights in the car as well. So, and I just, I just couldn't justify going out there at a time when women in the business probably wasn't as successful as it is today. Let's put it that way, or as accepting as it is today. And then,
but you did have a connection, even the slightest of a connection, but the promise of something.
Yeah, there was something. It was something there, and I should have taken it. I was 19. I should have tried it. I could have always driven home as long as they didn't try to take my car away. But I chickened out at the last minute. So what can I say? But yeah, but it's still like that was my story for the day, I guess. It's just interesting. Is like one of the reasons why I have such an interest in film is knowing how hard it is to get a project all the way through to the end. We talked a little bit in the green room about funding, and I want to touch on that a little bit. And actually kind of, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but Paramount Plus had the Al Ruddy story on. So Al was the producer. So Al was the producer for The Godfather. Helped basically, if you listen to Al Ruddy, discover Al Pacino, which I think was Al's probably first breakout role, was Michael Corleone. And then, of course, he had an assistant who knew the ins and out of the studio, because he was a fairly, if everything in his what do you say, miniseries is true.
I think everything in that was very much from his point of view.
Yes, I do think so.
It was his story. He was the executive producer of it, and it was he was sort of the hero of.
It was interesting, the connections with the mobs. The connection that he had with the mobs, and and I'm sure that they had a say in the movie in New York. I mean, who doesn't? It was New York at that time. So it was an interesting story, but it really kind of paced through him being a producer who was giving a budget, a certain amount of money. Then he constantly had to go back and get more money because he kept, he wanted to film in Sicily. He wanted to do all of these other things. I found it interesting from the standpoint of how much power a producer has, which I think we had this conversation before. I never thought that the producer was the one with the power. I had always thought that it was the director was one that no, that's not true at all. The producer has the money.
Well, no, depends who it is. It always depends on who it is and the personality. If you're talking about a Scorsese movie, do you think a director, the director is the power? Of course. So it depends who that director is. It depends who the star is. On a Tom Cruise movie, who do you think is the boss? So every project's a little bit different. One of my definitions, I get asked all the time, of course, what does a producer do? When a producer,
everything.
I tell this story a lot, that my son, who's now 38, but when he was young, I used to bring him to some movie sets. And he said to me at one point on one where we were down in Virginia, I think, he said, "Dad, you sit there in a chair with your name on the back, and people run back and forth, and they bring you cups of coffee, and they bring you candy bar, and they bring you anything you want, and you don't do anything. You just sit there. That's a great job."
Yeah.
That was his perception of it. Of course, what I sort of had two definitions for a producer: an involved producer, not one who was the star's hairdresser or who came up with the money or this or that. So a producer is actually producing the movie, making the movie, and one is to know absolutely the creative side and the financial side. You have to know the script and story and every inside out, and you have to know the budget and everything inside out, because particularly during the production, where about 80% of your money is spent, You know, if you spent maybe 10% or a little less of it in pre-production, what they call pre-production, the development of the script and the hiring of people and, you know, finding locations, all that stuff, and maybe another 10-15% in post-production, you know, doing the editing and the music and the sound effects and all of that sort of stuff. Pretty much 80% of your money goes out the door while the cameras are rolling. And while you're sitting in that chair with your cup of coffee that somebody might have brought you, you're keeping an eye on, you know, 150 people scurrying around in 50 different departments, literally. And you have to balance those two things, financial and creative, in your mind, because nobody else does. The director is focused on the creative
scene, right?
The production manager is focused on the financial and the budget. And if you don't get the shooting day done, you know, who decides, do we work overtime, you know, pay double time to the crew to get this, you know, these 4 shots done? Do we reschedule it a week from Tuesday when we might be back in the area and move the schedule around? Or do we cut the scene from the script entirely because it isn't important and who needs it, you know? Or do we rewrite it, which I've also done, sitting on the set. I've taken some pages and just rewritten them on the spot to where, you know, 3 pages of a scene might become 1, you know, 5 shots for the director might become 1 continuous master shot, and you can get it done and get it accomplished. But the producer has to know that and have both sides in the head. And in order to do that also, my other definition is the producer's job is to know what everybody else's job is. For all of those 150 people and all those 50 departments, and when I talk about departments, you know, you're talking about everybody from the directors and writers and, you know, actors to
prop
the
masters,
the makeup people and the truck drivers and, you know, on and on and on and on. You have to know what every one of those people is doing, and you need to know enough about their job. You don't need to know their whole job. Of course, that's what they're good at. You need to know enough about their job that you can make a decision on what they need and what they don't need. And when they come to you with requests, oh, I need another $20,000, you know, as you're suggesting from that series on The Godfather, you know, people coming, I need more costumes, I need this, I need that. Everybody always needs something. Can you swing it, or do you say, no, you don't need it, you know, or no, you have to make it work, I'm sorry, you know, figure out a way, you know, that, and you need to know enough to make those decisions.
Yeah, it's you know, when I had an interest in this before I really started researching all of the different pieces of it, it was, you know, I hear in the series that I watched about Star Wars and the CGI and all of that part of it, you know, I always thought that these guys just worked 18 hours a day and, you know, went to bed happy because they were being creative. And, you know, and I kind of did that, you know, on my own. We were shooting little scenes and stuff with my old VHS camera and made a spoof on Star Wars. We combined Star Wars, Star Trek, and Flash Gordon. So, and we wrote a little script up and we did this whole thing, you know, in front of a VHS camera, and we had, you know, cinnamon buns for Leia's hair. And I mean, it was just really great spoof before Spaceballs came out. And, you know, we're teenagers playing with this, and we did this all day in the summer, from morning until I went home at 10 o'clock. So that's the way I thought Hollywood was, you know, duh. So you don't make money if you're doing this way. So, you know, this is the fun part of that. We were being very creative. We certainly weren't getting paid for it, but it was interesting that the first part, like the first Star Wars, where they were really doing the investigation on, you know, how do we get this moving camera and how do we do all these special effects and all that. It was really interesting from that standpoint, in that they were putting in 18 hours a day and they had a set amount of money and they couldn't go over that set amount of money. So, you know, they had this desire and this love to create this thing. Little did they know that they would end up as ILM and, and then John
Right.
Dykstra wasn't taken or selected by, it's interesting the way that you hear this. Back at the time, I heard John Dykstra jumped ship and that George Lucas was mad at him for doing that. During the making of this docuseries that's on Disney, in the Star Wars area of it, it came back that George Lucas didn't select Dykstra. And a lot of it, according to George, if I have this right, was that John loved working the 18-hour days, but not charging for the 18-hour days and just working the heck out of it. So there was less organization. Let's say it that way. He wasn't the top. He loved being top man, but he didn't have the organizational skills that I think by the time Empire and Raiders came around, the whole Hollywood budget, if you will, was being scrutinized more, and you couldn't do that 18-hour day without getting paid the 18 hours, of which 10 of it was overtime, so a lot of that came in. So so it was interesting to hear the two, what I thought I heard back in the 80s and what I'm hearing today looking back. And of course, hindsight is 2020. So maybe there's a little bit of both in there where, Dykstra thought he was doing a wonderful job and was really hurt by the fact that he wasn't invited up to San Rafael to create ILM. Instead, it was George Kurtz or Gary Kurtz and another guy I can't remember, probably Richard Idlin. I think I remember his name more, but so they were all taken, and there's poor John. He jumps ships and does Star Trek. And then when you're hearing it now, you hear all of the information about the people that were doing Star Trek came to the Rafa Khan, for example, came to George Lucas and said, "Hey, I want your special effects and what can I do?" And George wanted to keep these certain number of people together, so he ended up having to have out of house, if you will, production. So Star Trek came in and used it. Raiders came in and used it. Then that just morphed into ILM. So ILMers, I guess, is what they called themselves at that time. So it's interesting when you come at it as a creative, you're coming at it as you just want to go somewhere and create. And I'm sure that from the producer on down, that creative side is there. And then and unfortunately, sometimes the producer is the only one being held accountable for, it's like you went over budget, therefore you're fired, or whatever. I mean, you're the one that could be fired by whoever has given you the money to make that movie, right?
Yes, again, depending on the situation, but sure, because I very often say, when young kids come into college and they say, "How do I get into business and whatnot?" And I usually say, first, you have to have a passion for some part of this business. I don't care if it's making deals or directing movies or driving a truck. The good part about it is that whatever you like in life, whether if you like clothes, you can do wardrobe on a movie. If you drive trucks, you can drive a truck on a movie. If you're an electrician, you can be in the electrical department, be a gaffer. You can do almost anything, but you have to have some passion for it, either creatively or otherwise, or the business will eat you up and spit you out happily.
Happily, yes.
Take what you have in your pockets and send you on your way, penniless in a way. So tell me you have a passion. And then once you have a passion, which half of the business do you have a passion for? Because to me, there's two big halves of business. One is making the product. Directors, actors, writers, electricians, makeup people, truck drivers, all the people who are going into the making of the project and the product. Then there's the other half of the business. Studio executives, network executives, lawyers, agents, production company, development people, on and on and on, who are involved in finding, funding, making a project happen, making a project viable. And the interesting thing is that I find is those two halves of the business are number one, very often two very different kinds of people. I've worked with people who love all the deal making, loving having the breakfasts and lunches and dinners and this and that, and making wheeling and dealing in the offices, and couldn't care less about making the product, about filmmaking in any of its forms. They say, well, we'll hire somebody for that. Their charge was deal making, right? And and then there are the people that are involved in it. And the two halves of the business don't really have very much to do with one another, and don't really understand very well what the other half of the business does.
Right.
Where do they meet? Usually around the producer level. You very often the studio executives become producers, tied to the studio. When they get fired, they get a production deal, that sort of thing. And who's going in and pitching and trying to sell the project so often is the producers. So at that level, as you say, they're the ones accountable to the people who put up the money, or the network, or the studio, or whatever.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I could go on all day, because you actually you actually heard how much my passion has always been involved in, and one of the reasons why I always like watching movies and series and different things like that is,
you are in the arts generally, which is great. So it's all part of it. You're a great painter, writer. So movie making is just part of it.
So it
maybe now, rather than before, the good part for people growing up now who want to be directors and want to make their own movie is they can take their cell phone and go out and film a movie in 4K, and have it look great, and use it as a calling card to sell themselves to the industry. You could just go out and do it. So
that was a lot harder back when I was younger.
That was a lot harder, no question.
So you have two events coming up in September, and this will be posted prior to that. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about where some folks can come and see you live and in person. One is in Georgia, and that's the one that has to do with the Andy Griffith and Johnny Cash movie, Murder in Coweta. Did I pronounce it?
Actually, both do.
Both do. Well, that's true. Yeah.
From a TV movie I did called Murder in Coweta County. Again, a true story, with Johnny Cash and Andy Griffith playing the lead roles in their opposite of their public image, where Andy played the bad guy villain fabulously, and Johnny played the sheriff, and he loved playing the sheriff, and as he said, getting to wear a star and carry a gun, and
usually he was on the other side of the law, so
and be the good guy. And I did that for CBS years ago, and it's very gratifying that people are still very interested in this movie, partly because of those two stars, partly also because it's a true story. It's still very well known and sort of infamous around Georgia, just south of Atlanta area. It was a big murder case. And so when I brought it back out after probably 20, 25 years, because it was done even before the DVD era, but I was getting inquiries about where could I see this. So I took the original production tapes and I made DVDs, and I started selling to people, and I went on Amazon with it and whatnot. And to make a long story short, I got calls from Georgia and other places, and Nashville and other places, Nashville's where the Johnny Cash Museum is, of course, and where Johnny was just outside of town, and Georgia where we filmed it, and even North Carolina, your new home of North Carolina, where it was Andy Griffith's hometown. And they started to invite Joanna and me back to show the movie and talk to people about making of it and working with those stars, of course, and all that sort of thing. And that's really been great, because it's nice to be treated well, but it's nice that people remember, that people are still interested, you know, and like to hear from you. And it's very gratifying, as I said to the people in North Carolina at one point. It's one fear, and I called it a fear. And I was on a stage with actors who'd been in the Andy Griffith Show, you know, and other creative people. And I said, one thing all of us here share is a fear. And that fear is having what we've done be forgotten. And it was because of, you know, all the people out in front of us, the audience, and the fans, and the people who are still interested, that keep these projects are alive, and this work that we've all done alive, and that's what's very gratifying to it. So these two events, we're showing the movie in Zebulon, Georgia, in Pike County, just south of Atlanta, in the courthouse where we filmed the courthouse scenes for the movie.
Cool.
So we're excited for that, and I will talk to people about it, and
you have a little Q&A session, right?
I'll have a Q&A session. I did that a few years ago. Well, a number of times I've done it down there with the director of the movie, Gary Nelson, who was a wonderful, wonderful director who unfortunately just passed away a few months ago. But one of the great directors for 30, 40 years in Hollywood. And
if you don't know, hold on 1 second. If you don't know who Gary Nelson is, Google him, people.
Absolutely.
Seriously,
Google him up on IMDb. Or Google. Absolutely, and you will see. So we did that together. This time I might be joined by one of the people who is portrayed in the movie, who is the only person portrayed in the movie. And this story took place in 1948.
Wow.
Rural Georgia. And Johnny was 1 year old at the time. He was the son of the murder victim. And he's a whole story in himself, because all growing up, his mother never told him his background. And he never knew this whole story until he was in his 20s. And he came back from the military. So, and Johnny's a wonderful guy, and he may come and join me in Georgia, you know, when we talk about the movie. So we'll be doing that there on September 17th. That's a Saturday morning and afternoon. And then after that, we'll be going back up to North Carolina, to your territory, to Mount Airy, North Carolina, Andy Griffith's hometown, which is the model for the town of Mayberry. Even though Andy for years denied it, you know, he had some not so great memories about growing up. He grew up very poor, you know, was not always treated the best. So he didn't go back to his hometown for years and years and years, and always denied that there was the connection, which was sort of obvious, until later on he came back for first there was the dedication of a highway in his name, and in town, a part of outside of town, and then TV Land put up a statue of Sheriff Andy and Opie Ron Howard in front of the Andy Griffith Museum, and he came back for both of those events. And he said, you know, a lot of people say there's a lot of similarities between Mayberry and Mount Airy, North Carolina, you know, my hometown. It sort of seems that way, doesn't it? You know, and sort of, you know, over the first time. And so they have a thing called Mayberry Days, which is now a week-long festival where thousands of people descend on this small town and celebrate the Andy Griffith Show primarily, but Andy generally. So the folks who run the festival and the Andy Griffith Museum, the Surrey Arts Council, were kind enough to invite Joanna and me to start coming, you know, about 4 or 5 years ago, and be part of it, because I worked with Andy in another capacity, from another angle, not as Sheriff Andy, but as the bad guy in Murder in Coweta County but which showed really his acting talent, his dramatic chops, if you'll say, because he was a fabulous dramatic actor and he loved doing it, and it was obviously great to work with him.
Yeah, you kind
So
of
he was good enough to invite us back. We have a couple of screenings, so we'll be having that during the following week. I think it's the 20th and 21st.
Okay.
Of September, and we'll be showing the movie and talking about it, and then being part of the festivities, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's when you think about Andy Griffith's career, and Johnny Cash's actually too, you could say it the same for both of them. He had a wide range of movies that he did. I mean, he was Sergeant York, I think, at one point, and
No Time for Sergeants.
No Time for Sergeants. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. And then, so he had that, early black and white career.
A Face in the Crowd.
A Face in the Crowd.
Where he first got famous.
Yeah.
Which was fascinating. Also playing, kind of a bad guy, or at least a young guy who went crazy, which was fascinating for me. Just a little tidbit, because that was Andy Griffith's first movie. It was also Lee Remick's first movie.
Oh, yeah. And I know where you're going with this.
So many young people now don't know Lee Remick.
Oh, I do.
Who was a major star of the 50s, 60s,
Wonderful 70s. Actress, beautiful lady.
And beautiful, wonderful. And I did a TV movie with her and Angela Lansbury and Polly Holiday, Christmas movie called The Gift of Love. And it was the first movie for both Andy and Lee. They got married in that movie. And I'm in Northern Coweta County with Andy, and it was about 6 months later, made The Gift of Love with Lee. So to me, nice. quite a connection, and the fact that they were both in their first movie together. But yes, Andy did a range of movies, range of projects.
Right.
Was just a fabulous actor with tremendous range. And as I like to say, Andy was an actor who liked to sing a little, and Johnny was a singer who liked to act a little. So it was very interesting dealing with two very different guys from different parts of the entertainment world, together.
Yeah. So if you're in the area around Mount Airy, which is just a little north of Winston-Salem, I would say probably a 30-minute drive from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Head over and make sure you see Dick and Joanna there. And then also, if you're down in Georgia, just south of Atlanta is where he'll be, in Zebulon, Georgia for that. If you have any questions for Dick about those two events, you can send them either to me or to Dick, either way. Dick, you want to give your email address real quick?
Sure. You can send it to dick.atkins@afilms.org, AAFILMS.org, and happy to answer any questions. There's also a Facebook page, my own Facebook page, with a Facebook page for each of these movies from Northern Coweta County, for The Gift of Love, A Christmas Story.
Yeah, and I'll put those up on the screen when we get to this point, so that they can have them there.
Sort of follow these projects and movies and what's going on.
Well, I like having our chats with you and figuring out where I think it gives a real life indication of what the struggles are in making movies today. And I know I had Karen Espina on, who is an independent filmmaker, and she was saying there was a big difference between budgets between series and film, and the bigger budget was series. Now, I'm not particularly sure that means that they're going to be making more projects. I just think that series takes a lot more people and effort to get made than a movie, maybe.
She's probably talking about an interesting dynamic, because there's different areas, of course, of films, of motion pictures.
Right.
If you're talking the Marvel superhero, which you're certainly not talking about smaller budgets.
Right.
You're talking about $200 million budgets, not small. She may be talking about independent films, documentaries that she may make.
She may be.
You're talking on much smaller scale, vastly smaller scale. For TV series, which used to be, and still are to an extent at a different level, much more contained, because the distribution outlet, sort of what your audience is, much more than what an audience is going to be for a movie in the theaters. You don't know if 10 million people are going to show up or nobody's going to show up, so you don't really know what your return is. So you're not really ever sure what to spend, so there's always that dynamic of what's worth spending, and on TV series, different. It's a per episode thing, whether it's a so-called limited series, a one season series, or an ongoing series. And with the advent of the streamers, Netflix was the first one to start to change this end of the business, and now it's spread to everything. The budgets have ballooned to extraordinary levels, and it's interesting that I always found it interesting too, on an average motion picture, you're spending the majority of the budget that's lopsided on what they call below the line, as opposed to above the line. In production terms, above the line means the creative people, the actors, directors, writers, the ones who don't depend on what happens each day of production, in a way, fixed fees, that sort of thing. Below the line is all the production categories during production and post-production that depend on how much time it takes. If you film 100 days or you film 20 days, if you film, how many locations you film in, where you fly around the world, all of those different aspects go into below the line, all those different categories. And if you're talking about, a $200 million movie, the stars might be getting paid $25 million, but it's still, you have $150 million being spent on all of the production aspects of it, not the least of which is the CGI that you were talking about before. TV, very often it's flipped around, that the lopsided amount of the money is above the line on the stars. And because you're paying to get eyeballs on the TV, and it's less quantifiable, or at least it used to be, that if you did 3 extra days of production, that could pay off for you on television. You're not necessarily going to get more eyeballs on the series. So we used to tend to squeeze those productions. We used to squeeze below the line, shoot in a shorter time frame, so we could spend more money on the stars and whatnot, and what we could put up on the screen. In motion pictures, it's the other way. They're thinking, not only do I get these stars, but if I can do 5 more big explosions, do a little more CGI of Spider-Man swinging through, New York, that sort of thing, that who knows, maybe that'll get me another 5 million people in the theater, and it's going to make me another $50 million or $100 million. So who knows? So it's different dynamics. It depends on what level you're talking about, each of those worlds,
And then there's this whole thing called suspension of disbelief, but we won't go there because I've kept you long enough today. So, so thank you so much for being a part of this. Again, catch Dick and Joanna in either Zebulon, Georgia or Mount Airy, North Carolina, and check out his biography, if you will, out of it on LinkedIn. Again, LinkedIn, Facebook, or his email address. He'll be happy to answer questions anywhere. And when you're down in our territory, if you can squeeze us in a day, that's great. If not, maybe we'll head over to Mount Airy because that's a little closer than Zebulon, Georgia. But
love to. That would be great. That would be great.
I know you'll be busy.
You get a taste of Mayberry.
There you go. Well, and my husband used to drive down with his family. Well, his mom and dad would drive him down through Fancy Gap, which isn't far from Mount Airy either. So,
it's funny that you mentioned Fancy Gap.
Okay.
Because right by Fancy Gap, which is just over the border in Virginia, right, is where the Mayberry name came from.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
There is a town called Meadows of Dan right near Fancy Gap. And if you go there, all of a sudden you happen on a couple of buildings that one is the Mayberry Trading Post.
Yep.
General store. There's a Mayberry church. There's a little Mayberry this or that, 2 or 3 or 4 little things that used to be his little community of Mayberry.
Right.
And Andy Griffith's grandparents lived up on the mountain above this area. And his grandfather used to come down and trade, I don't know, his pigs for pork or whatever at the Mayberry Trading Post. And this is where Andy got the name of Mayberry.
Okay. Well, there you go. A little history for everybody.
How about that?
Well, the other thing that used to happen was the first of the 4 kids that could spot Pilot Mountain, also known as Mount Pilot,
right,
got a quarter. So they would all anxiously sit there and wait as they were driving down to find Mount Pilot. So go in there. So anyway, have fun, be safe, and thank you so much for joining us again. I think, at some point, maybe we ought to talk about doing a review of films and different things like that on a separate podcast or something. Because I felt like we've touched on so many different ones, and had a ball talking about it. And again, thank you so much for your time, Dick. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, so bye everybody. Take care. Art Chat is made possible by the support of the Artistic Harmonies Association. Create your next aha experience with us.